You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 3.
Even though it was the gateway to Nepal, Tribhuvan International Airport was, by the standards of the world's major airports, not very large. It had far fewer runways than Heathrow Airport in London, and it handled less than 10% of the air traffic of Los Angeles Airport in America. But while those airports were memorable for their hustle and bustle, Tribhuvan was right next door to something that trumped any claim to fame, the colossal mountain range of ice and rock called the Himalayas. The Himalayas were a magnet that drew people from around the world. Many who came to Nepal were tourists who wanted to experience the beauty of the country and the majesty of its mountains. Others were businessmen and women who saw Nepal as a land of commercial opportunity, and every so often, a group of travelers would come in search of more than money or a fun vacation. The flight from Vaile to Nepal took 14 hours. When the plane was an hour away from landing, the pilot announced that the Himalayas were visible from the windows on the right. Isabelle, Laheeti and Twig pressed their noses against the cold glass and stared down at the jagged tract of mountains that were glittering like diamonds in the setting sun. Somewhere down there, deep inside that 1,000 kilometers of beautiful but inhospitable terrain, was a new species of ape just waiting to be discovered. Isabelle imagined a yeti looking up at the planes soaring overhead and wondered if yetis, if they even existed, had any concept of aeroplanes. Probably not, because they were, after all, just big monkeys whose brains were smaller than a human's. Aside from the fact that a yeti was probably very strong, she didn't think it would be hard to catch because it wasn't very smart. Not as smart as a human anyway, and the professor Nicky Zipster had confidence in Burnmaster's ability to catch a yeti, so Isabelle did too. The plane touched down and taxied off the runway. When the seatbelt light switched off, Gulbenkian stood up and retrieved the 14-year-old's bags from the overhead compartments. His huge body filled the aisle and he had to stoop to make sure he didn't ram his head through the ceiling, which would have been embarrassing and potentially expensive. Laheeti's credit card would have covered the damage, but it wouldn't be a good start to their low-profile entry into Nepal. The plane had stopped in its designated place about 100 meters from the airport terminal, and a purpose-built utility truck with a staircase on its rear was in position beneath the open doorway in the fuselage of the plane. The air hostesses waited at the door and wished the passengers a safe vacation in Nepal as they disembarked. Gulbenkian exited first, as was his practice, to ensure that the area was safe for the young prince to proceed. They descended the steel stairs and inhaled lungfuls of the cool mountain air. Twigger was surprised to see that the Himalayas were clearly visible. The icy mountains thrust high into the darkening sky, dominating the northern horizon and attracting the attention of everybody who disembarked the plane. Even Burnmaster, who had seen it many times in his life, stopped and stared in silence for a long moment before encouraging the group towards the airport terminal. Trailing behind Burnmaster, Twig noticed 3 men with shiny silver hair staring in wide-eyed wonder at the mountains in the distance. The men turned around slowly, their gazes sweeping from one side of the airport to the other, drinking in the vista with their black eyes. Twig couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was, but something seemed amiss. Looking more closely, he saw that the 3 men were huge, at least as big as Gulbenkian, and their facial features, which seemed a little odd, were identical. Their clothes were identical too. They were all dressed in blue jeans, black sweaters, and carrying red backpacks. Clearly, individuality and creativity were not strong traits in that family. But the garish silver hairstyles were radically different: a punk rock mohawk, an outrageous mullet straight from the 80s, and a short back-insides army-style flat top. Something didn't add up. The physique was intimidating, the clothes were conservative, and the hair was flamboyant. It's like they're made up of bits that don't belong together, Twig thought. They must be brothers. In fact, I reckon they must be triplets. They look the same except for the hair. Isabelle's gaze followed Twig's. She was a nice girl, but sometimes the bad thoughts came unbidden. Wow, she said under her breath, their mama must have been ugly. Ease up, replied Twiggy, then added, they are a bit odd though, aren't they? Were they on our plane? She pondered. The islander boy shook his head. No way, I'd remember seeing them, he replied. They must have gotten off another plane. Look at the size of them, continued Isabelle. And the faces, where do you think they're from? Twig considered this for a moment. Silver hair, so, Sweden, he suggested. Swedes have blonde hair, not silver hair, Isabelle explained. What about old people from Sweden? Asked Twig. Do those guys look old? Isabelle countered. Twig conceded they didn't look a day over 20. Why don't you go ask them? He said. but Burnmaster and Gulbenkian had already passed by the silver-haired giants and were almost to the airport terminal. Isabelle winked at Twig and said, "Too late." They walked into the heated interior of the building without a backward glance. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The genetically engineered supersoldier designated GX2, otherwise known as Maine, stared up at the Himalayas as the last rays of the setting sun tinted the jagged tops of the mountain range with a soft orange glow. High above, the first stars of the night twinkled brightly in the deepening blue of the sky. Save for the occasional murmur of conversation from people passing by, the area was quiet, and with his eyes closed, he imagined himself standing alone on one of the distant snow-capped summits. He felt a cool breeze brush across his face and smiled. The air smelled crisp and clean. North Korea and his mission orders suddenly felt like they were a million miles away. Standing before the largest mountain range in the world, the giant GX was confused by a strange feeling of freedom and beauty, two concepts which were completely incompatible with his strict military training. Up until now, his only idea of beauty was a well-oiled firearm, and his only notion of freedom was the time he spent asleep in his bunk. He looked across at his brothers and wondered if they were feeling the same thing. Flattop was the first to shake himself out of the reverie. "We should get moving," he grunted, and lumbered towards the airport terminal building. Maine let his eyes linger on the mountain tops for another long moment before turning and following Mohawk and Flattop. Laheeti had been right when he said he had arranged for them all to enter Nepal with a minimum of fanfare. Burnmaster had half expected to be greeted by a flock of reporters and television cameras in the airport, but he was gratified to see that he and his companions attracted no more attention than anybody else. It was true that they were an odd little group. One giant islander, one man dressed in khaki, and 3 14-year-olds, not a typical mum and dad family going on its annual overseas vacation, but not so strange that people noticed. Of course, Gulbenkian always drew a few interested stares due to his immense size, but that was expected. When the GXs walked into the airport, they also attracted quite a few stares. The GXs stared straight back, mostly out of curiosity. Up until they departed North Korea, the only people they had ever seen were gun-toting military types. Now they had been thrust into the confusing civilian world filled with air hostesses, boarding passes, and in-flight entertainment, and it was blowing their minds. Their masters in North Korea had provided them with fake South Korean passports and cover stories to match. Under no circumstances were they to reveal that they were soldiers of the North Korean army. Each had committed to memory the details of his new identity. While they waited in the immigration queue, they watched the process carefully. Each time a traveler approached the counter, handed his or her passport to the immigration officer, and he stamped the passport. Then came the next person and the next person. It looked like a piece of cake. 10 minutes later, it was Flattop's turn, and he was ushered towards the seated officer wearing a neat blue uniform. Flattop felt comfortable with uniforms. Placing the open passport on the counter, he waited for the officer to stamp it and send him on his way. The officer raised the stamp in the air and then paused. He looked up, his eyes rising higher and higher until they met Flattop's. He had a frown on his face. "You from South Korea?" he asked in broken English. The giant GX nodded. The officer's gaze took in the face and the physique, and he said, "You not look like come from South Korea." He leaned over, looking past Flattop's shoulder at the 2 GXs waiting in the queue. "Do they travel with you?" Flattop kept his gaze on the little man in front of him. "Yes," he replied flatly. The officer waved Mohawk and Maine over to the counter where they placed their fake South Korean passports into the officer's waiting hands. After examining each document carefully, he stared up at the GXs with a suspicious look on his face, then back down at the passports. Flattop wasn't sure what the problem was, and all he could do was wait to see what would happen. He was trained to be aggressive, but his mission objective was to slip in and out of Nepal without attracting attention, so his training wasn't much use in this situation. The officer looked at Mohawk and said, "I never see young Korean person with silver hair." It was a statement, not a question. Mohawk exchanged a glance with Maine and then replied, "We dye it this color so we look cool. We're in a rock band in South Korea," added Maine, "called Silver Soul." "You even dye your eyebrows?" the officer asked. "The fans love it," Maine said, raising one silver eyebrow suggestively. "Your eyelashes too?" the officer queried. "Yes, it's all part of the show," Maine explained. The officer considered this reply and said, "You all very big and strong. I think you want to climb mountain, need special permit to climb mountain." Mohawk grinned. No, definitely no climbing, I'm afraid of heights. Maine nodded and stated, it's true, he's petrified. We intend to see the local sights in Kathmandu, added Flat Top. The officer stared at them for a moment longer and then suddenly stamped all 3 passports. Okay, he sighed. Have safe time in Nepal. The GXs grabbed their passports and moved past the immigration counter in a hurry. When they were out of earshot, Mohawk looked at Flat Top and said, What was that all about? I don't know, Flat Top replied, but let's keep moving before someone starts asking more questions. On the other side of the airport, Burnmaster gathered his group together in the brightly lit foyer next to the exit doors to discuss their next steps. Outside, the sun had set and the night sky was filled with the stars of the northern constellations. I've arranged a hotel in Kathmandu Valley for us to stay at tonight, he said. I figure it's too late for us to meet Nikki now and it's been a long flight anyway, so we should just catch a taxi to the hotel and get a good night's sleep. We can start early tomorrow morning. They all agreed it was a good idea. One other thing, Burnmaster continued. I don't know what you all told your parents to get them to agree to let you come to Nepal, and I don't want to know. But we're here now and you are all my and Gulbenkian's responsibility. Right, Gull? Yep, that's right, the huge man stuttered. So no antics and no running off on your own, Burnmaster said sternly. Kathmandu is a big place and I don't want to have to find you out there. And remember, Nepal's not as safe as England or Vavu, so pay attention to what's going on around you. That means cars, people, animals, everything. Got it? When the South African wanted to get his message across, he sure knew how to do it. They all nodded vigorously and gripped their backpacks more tightly, lest a thief snatch it from them there and then. Burnmaster looked satisfied with their responses. Shouldering his travel-worn backpack, he headed out of the building and into the Nepalese night, followed by the rest of the group.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.